The restaurant buzzed with the hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware against plates. Families gathered at tables, friends laughed over shared meals, and couples leaned close, their voices hushed in the candlelight. Amid this warm and lively scene, a boy hesitated at the door, his small frame silhouetted against the fading sunlight. He looked no older than 10, his coat slightly too large, and his shoes worn from many steps. His skin was dark, and his eyes held a nervous curiosity as they scanned the room. Inside, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. A few heads turned toward the boy, their expressions unreadable, while others went about their meals, unaware of the silent tension unfolding. Standing behind the counter was James, a middle-aged waiter with a sharp eye and an air of authority. His crisp white shirt and neatly tied apron spoke of someone who took pride in his work. But when his gaze fell on the boy, something in his demeanor changed. James stiffened, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The boy stepped forward, his small hands clutching a few crumpled bills. He approached a table near the window, dancing nervously at the diners before sliding into an empty seat. His eyes darted around, searching for someone to take his order. James watched from the counter, his lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, he strode over, his footsteps brisk and deliberate. The diners at the surrounding tables quieted, their curiosity piqued by the interaction about to unfold. The boy looked up as James reached his table. "Can I help you?" James's voice was clipped, his words carrying an edge that cut through the ambient noise. The boy nodded quickly, his voice soft but determined. "I'd like to order, please." He placed his crumpled bills on the table, his small fingers smoothing them out as best he could. James glanced at the money, then back at the boy. His expression hardened. "We don't serve people like you here," he said flatly, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. The boy's face fell, a mixture of confusion and hurt flashing across his features. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice rang out from the other side of the room. "Is there a problem here?" All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. A man in his late 40s stood near the back of the restaurant, his demeanor calm yet commanding. His sharp suit and polished shoes hinted at a man of importance, though his warm expression suggested he was approachable. He began walking toward the table, his steps measured and confident. James straightened, clearly caught off guard by the interruption. "No problem," he said quickly, his tone defensive, "just enforcing the rules." The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting between James and the boy. "Rules, you say? And what rule would that be?" The restaurant fell silent, every patron holding their breath as the tension thickened. The boy looked down at his hands, his shoulders hunching slightly under the weight of the moment. James hesitated, his confidence wavering under the man's steady gaze. But before he could respond, the man turned to the boy and smiled gently. "What's your name, son?" The boy looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel," he said. "Well, Samuel," the man said, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. "Why don't you tell me what you'd like to eat?" James's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to protest, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with anticipation. What would happen next? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the story teetered on the edge of an unexpected turn. Samuel's eyes widened at the man's kindness. No one had spoken to him like that in a long time. He hesitated, unsure if this was a trick or if the man truly meant it. His small fingers gripped the edge of the table, and he leaned forward slightly. "I was just hoping for something warm to eat," Samuel murmured, barely above a whisper. His voice was thin, like it had been silenced too many times before. The man smiled, but his eyes didn't lose their sharpness as they flicked back to James. "Well, that doesn't sound like too much to ask, does it?" James shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think." "You don't think?" the man interrupted, his tone still calm, but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "No, I suppose you don't. Now, why don't you fetch the menu?" James opened his mouth, as if to argue, But the murmurs rippling through the restaurant stopped him. He could feel the stares of other customers boring into him. He turned sharply and walked back toward the kitchen, his stiff posture betraying his irritation. Samuel's shoulders relaxed just a little. He looked at the man with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Samuel, my name is Mr. Bennet." His voice softened. "You here alone?" Samuel hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in and rescue him from the conversation. But no one came. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied quietly. Mr. Bennet nodded slowly, studying the boy. "Where's your family?" Samuel's fingers tightened on the table. He swallowed hard, but the words didn't come easily. "My mom, she's working. A lot. And my grandma, she's sick. I thought I could get something to eat and bring her some." His voice cracked at the end. Mr. Bennet's expression softened, but behind his calm gaze was something sharper, a flicker of anger, not aimed at Samuel, but the situation. He sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Before he could respond, James returned, slamming a menu down on the table. "There," James muttered, barely masking his disdain. "Happy now?" Mr. Bennet didn't even look at the menu. His eyes locked on James, cold and steady. "No, not yet. But I will be once this boy gets the best meal your kitchen can offer." James's nostrils flared, but something in Mr. Bennet's voice made him think twice. Without another word, he turned and stormed back toward the kitchen. Mr. Bennet shook his head slightly and turned back to Samuel. "Now let's see. What do you feel like eating?" Samuel blinked, almost overwhelmed by the sudden shift in his circumstances. "I don't know. Anything. Anything hot." Mr. Bennet smiled, though it didn't fully reach his eyes. "Hot it is." The restaurant slowly began to stir again, conversations picking up in cautious murmurs. Some customers whispered to each other, stealing glances at Samuel and Mr. Bennet. Others turned away, pretending they hadn't noticed anything at all. But not everyone looked away. From the far corner of the restaurant, a woman in a tailored coat sat alone, stirring her coffee absently. Her eyes never left Mr. Bennet. She tilted her head, studying the scene with keen interest. Her fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the table, as if thinking. Mr. Bennet glanced around briefly and caught sight of her. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before she turned her gaze back to her coffee. Mr. Bennet's jaw tightened. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, James burst through the swinging doors, muttering under his breath. The cook, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, looked up. "What's your problem now, James?" the cook asked. James scowled. "That kid out there, that man's making me serve him like he owns the place." The cook wiped his hands on his apron. "Maybe you should. You know who that is?" James frowned. "Some big shot, I guess." The cook leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That's William Bennet. Owns half the buildings on this block, including this restaurant." James froze. The cook smirked. "Yeah, so if I were you, I'd get back out there with a smile on my face." James's face paled. Without another word, he turned and pushed through the doors, his mind racing. At the table, Samuel sat quietly, glancing around nervously. Mr. Bennet noticed. "You all right, son?" he asked gently. Samuel nodded, but his eyes betrayed him. "People are staring." Mr. Bennet leaned in slightly. "Let them stare. You're not doing anything wrong." Samuel swallowed hard and gave a small nod. James returned moments later, this time with forced politeness. "The kitchen's preparing something special. Won't be long." Mr. Bennet gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "Good." James turned away quickly, eager to escape the man's icy stare. But the tension in the room didn't lift. The woman in the corner stood up, smoothing her coat. She casually made her way toward the exit, but not before pausing near Mr. Bennet's table. "Kind gesture," she said quietly, her tone unreadable. Mr. Bennet didn't look up. Some things don't need applause. She gave a faint smile. Not applause, just curiosity. Then, without another word, she slipped out the door, the bell above it jingling softly. Samuel watched her go, his brow furrowed. Who was that? Mr. Bennet's eyes lingered on the door for a moment. No one important, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees along the street. The sky had darkened, and in the shadows of the city, more stories were quietly unfolding, stories that Samuel and even Mr. Bennet couldn't yet see coming. Inside the restaurant, Samuel sat quietly, unaware that his simple need for a warm meal had stirred something far bigger than he could understand. And Mr. Bennet, for all his calm and control, knew this was far from over. The minutes stretched on in tense silence, the restaurant's lively hum subdued by the lingering weight of the confrontation. Samuel sat quietly, his small hands folded on the table, but his eyes shifted anxiously around the room. The kind smile from Mr. Bennet gave him some comfort, but Samuel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. He wasn't used to this much attention. Mr. Bennet leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but thoughtful. His mind wasn't on the meal. It was on James, on the icy reception Samuel had faced the moment he stepped inside, and on the woman in the tailored coat who seemed too interested in their exchange. Something wasn't sitting right with him. Behind the scenes, James paced in the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. Sweat clung to the back of his neck despite the cool air. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact before pressing call. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. What? James lowered his voice. We might have a problem. William Bennet's here, with some kid. The line went quiet for a second. Then Bennet, what's he doing there? James stole a glance through the crack in the kitchen door. I don't know. The kid just walked in, and Bennet's acting like he owns the place. Because he asterisked, does asterisk own the place? You idiot, the voice snapped. Listen, don't make this worse. Keep your head down and do your job. I'll handle it. The call ended before James could respond. His hand tightened around the phone. Back at the table, Samuel slowly stirred the water in his glass with a straw, his mind far away. Samuel, Mr. Bennet's voice brought him back. Tell me more about your mother. Where does she work? Samuel hesitated. At the laundry down the street. She works late, sometimes all night. Mr. Bennet nodded slowly. That's hard work. And your grandmother? Samuel's eyes dropped to his lap. She's at home. Can't move around much. I tried to help, but his voice trailed off. Mr. Bennet didn't press further. He understood enough. Samuel wasn't just hungry. He was carrying the weight of a family struggling to stay afloat. The door to the restaurant swung open again, and the woman in the tailored coat returned. This time she wasn't alone. A tall man in a dark suit followed her, his eyes cold and calculating. His presence was quiet but commanding, the kind that made people instinctively step aside. Mr. Bennet noticed them immediately. His posture straightened, and a flicker of recognition passed through his eyes. The woman approached their table slowly. Mr. Bennet, she greeted smoothly, her voice soft, but with an undertone of steel. We meet again. Mr. Bennet's face remained composed. Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Bringing friends now? The man beside her didn't speak. He merely observed, his sharp eyes darting between Samuel and Mr. Bennet. Let's not play games, the woman said, her polite smile thin. You're making a scene, and some people are uncomfortable. Mr. Bennet leaned forward, his voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous tone. If they're uncomfortable watching a child get treated like garbage, maybe they should rethink why they're here. A smile didn't falter. This isn't about the boy. It's about you. This place. These people. They don't like disruptions. Neither do I. Samuel looked between them, confused and uneasy. Mr. Bennet's eyes narrowed. And what exactly do you want? She shrugged lightly. Just a conversation. Outside. Mr. Bennet didn't move. Anything you have to say, you can say here. Her expression hardened, the polite mask slipping just a bit. "Don't make this difficult, William." The man in the suit subtly reached inside his coat, but Mr. Bennet raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "You're in the wrong place if you think you can intimidate me," Mr. Bennet said, his voice like steel under velvet. The woman sighed, brushing non-existent dust off her sleeve. "Fine, but don't say I didn't try to be civil." With that, she turned and walked out, the man following close behind. Mr. Bennet watched the door swing close behind them, his mind racing. This wasn't random. Samuel's presence, the sudden interest from these people. It was all connected somehow. But how? Samuel stared up at him, fear creeping into his voice. Who were they? Mr. Bennet shook his head slowly. No one you need to worry about. But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. In the kitchen, James wiped his sweaty palms on his apron. He knew who the woman was. She wasn't the type to get involved in small matters. If she was here, something bigger was at play. And he had the sinking feeling he was right in the middle of it. Outside, the woman lit a cigarette with steady hands. The man in the suit stood beside her, silent. "He's going to be a problem," she muttered, exhaling slowly. The man's voice was low. "Should I call in the others?" "Not yet," she said. "Let's see how far he's willing to go for the boy." Back inside, the waiter nervously set a steaming plate of food in front of Samuel. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the air. Samuel's eyes lit up, but he didn't touch it. Mr. Bennet watched him closely. "Go ahead. It's for you." Samuel hesitated. "Are we safe here?" Mr. Bennet gave a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "For now." But even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure if they were true. Somewhere beyond the restaurant walls, something was moving. Plans were unfolding, and Samuel, without knowing it, was at the center of it all. And Mr. Bennet knew he had just stepped into a game he couldn't afford to lose. The restaurant felt heavier now, the air thick with unspoken tension. Conversations that had once filled a room had dwindled into cautious whispers. Samuel picked at his food, though the smell of the warm meal was tempting. His appetite had been dulled by the strange encounter with the cold woman and the man in the suit. Mr. Bennet watched the boy carefully, but his mind was elsewhere. Something wasn't adding up. The woman's sudden appearance, her cryptic warnings, and James' odd behavior. It all pointed to something deeper, something dangerous. Mr. Bennet slowly reached into his coat, fingers brushing against his phone. He hesitated, then pulled it out and typed a quick message. Asterisk are here, watching. Find out who they are. Now. Asterisk. He sent the text and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the room, James stood near the counter, pretending to organize menus, but his eyes kept flicking toward Mr. Bennet. He was pale, his hand trembling slightly as he wiped imaginary dust from the counter. He knew something Mr. Bennet didn't. The front door creaked open again, and this time 2 men in dark coats stepped inside. They scanned the room casually but with a purpose. They didn't belong here. Mr. Bennet's jaw tightened. Samuel followed his gaze, noticing the men. "Who are they?" he asked quietly, his small voice filled with fear. Mr. Bennet leaned closer, keeping his tone calm. "Listen to me, Samuel. No matter what happens, you stay right here. Don't move. You understand." Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes wide. The 2 men walked toward the counter, speaking quietly to James. James gestured subtly toward Mr. Bennet's table, his movements stiff and uneasy. Mr. Bennet caught it. The taller of the 2 men turned, making direct eye contact with him. There was no hesitation. They began moving toward the table, slow and deliberate. Mr. Bennet stood up smoothly, placing a steady hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Stay seated." The men stopped a few feet away. The taller one spoke first, his voice calm but cold. "Mr. Bennet, we need to have a word." Mr. Bennet didn't flinch. "I'm busy." The shorter man smirked. "It's important. You'll want to hear this." Mr. Bennet's eyes didn't leave them. "Then say it here." The taller man's expression darkened. Not in front of the kid. Samuel shrank back in his seat. Mr. Bennet's stare hardened. Then we have nothing to talk about. The man's jaw tightened. You're making this harder than it has to be. Mr. Bennet slowly leaned forward. No, *U**R. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the restaurant door swung open again, this time more forcefully. A younger man, slightly out of breath, strode in. He looked directly at Mr. Bennet and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Mr. Bennet's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to look. He knew what it meant. The two men glanced back at the door, realizing they were no longer in control. Mr. Bennet's voice was quiet but firm. You're outnumbered. Walk away. The taller man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. The shorter one wasn't as patient. This isn't over. Without another word, they turned and left, pushing the door open with unnecessary force. The restaurant exhaled, but the tension didn't disappear. Mr. Bennet sat back down, his eyes still on the door. Samuel, we need to leave. Now. Samuel's fork clattered onto the plate. But why? Mr. Bennet didn't waste time explaining. He pulled out a few bills, placed them on the table, and stood up. Come on. Samuel scrambled to his feet, grabbing his coat. They moved toward the door, but as they passed James, Mr. Bennet paused. His cold stare met James's nervous eyes. Whatever they're paying you, it's not worth it. James swallowed hard but said nothing. Outside, the cold air hit Samuel's face, sharp and biting. The streets were darker now, the glow from streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. Mr. Bennet scanned the street. The two men were nowhere in sight, but that didn't ease his mind. A black car idle at the curb, windows tinted. Too dark to see who was inside. Mr. Bennet tightened his grip on Samuel's shoulder. Keep walking, he murmured. They moved quickly down the street, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the brick buildings. The car's engine revved softly and began to follow. Samuel looked up, panic rising. They're following us. Mr. Bennet glanced over his shoulder. I know. He turned sharply into a narrow alleyway, pulling Samuel along. The car didn't follow but continued creeping down the main road. In the shadows of the alley, Mr. Bennet pulled out his phone and made a call. A voice answered immediately. They know I'm involved, Mr. Bennet said. They're after the boy. The voice on the other end was grim. You need to get out. Now. I need answers first. There was a pause. Then, the woman you saw, her name's Evelyn Grant. She's connected to some heavy players in the city. If she's involved, this isn't just about the boy. Mr. Bennet's grip on the phone tightened. Then what is it about? We don't know yet, but it's big. Bigger than you think. The call ended. Mr. Bennet slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at Samuel, who was shivering now, not just from the cold. What do they want with you, Samuel? He asked quietly. Samuel shook his head. I don't know. I swear, I just wanted to eat. Mr. Bennet studied him, searching for answers in his frightened eyes. But before he could speak, a shadow moved at the alley entrance. They weren't alone. Mr. Bennet pushed Samuel behind him, eyes locked on the figure slowly stepping into view. It wasn't one of the men from before. It was Evelyn Grant. Her calm, icy smile returned as she slowly clapped her hands together. Well done, Mr. Bennet. But this is far from over. Behind her, more figures emerged from the shadows, closing in. Mr. Bennet's pulse quickened, every muscle tense. They had walked straight into the trap. And now there was nowhere left to run. Mr. Bennet's eyes narrowed as Evelyn Grant stood at the mouth of the alley, a slow, deliberate clapping echoing off the brick walls. The shadows behind her shifted, revealing more figures, men dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by the dim light. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a setup. Samuel pressed himself tighter against Mr. Bennet's side, his small frame trembling. Evelyn's cold smile didn't waver. You've made quite the mess tonight, Mr. Bennet. All of this over a boy. Mr. Bennet didn't move. His stance was solid, protective. What do you want with him? Evelyn let out a soft chuckle. Oh, it's not about him. Not really. But since you're so interested, maybe I'll let you in on a little secret. She took a slow step forward. That boy is more important than you realize. Mr. Bennet's mind raced. This wasn't making sense. Samuel was just a boy, scared, hungry, alone. But Evelyn's confidence, her calculated movements, suggested something much bigger. Samuel's voice broke through the tension, barely a whisper. I didn't do anything. I don't even know them. Evelyn's gaze flicked to Samuel, and for a brief moment, something like annoyance crossed her face. Oh, sweetheart, it's not what asterisk you've asterisked done. It's what you asterisk are asterisk. Before Mr. Bennet could press for answers, a loud crash echoed from the street behind Evelyn. Shouts followed. The men with her instantly turned, hands moving toward their belts. Evelyn's expression darkened. What now? From around the corner, another group appeared, but they weren't with Evelyn. Dressed in plain clothes, but moving with purpose, they advanced quickly. One of them, a woman in a dark leather jacket, shouted, Bennet, get the boy out of here. Mr. Bennet recognized her immediately. Detective Harper. He hadn't spoken to her in years. Though she was here, things were worse than he thought. Evelyn's smirk faltered. Oh, so you're not the only one playing hero tonight. Chaos erupted. Evelyn's men moved to intercept the newcomers, but Harper's team was faster. A struggle broke out at the alley entrance, buying just enough time. Run, Harper barked. Mr. Bennet didn't hesitate. He grabbed Samuel's hand and pulled him deeper into the alley. They weaved through narrow paths, the sounds of fighting fading behind them. Samuel struggled to keep up, gasping for breath. Who were they? Why are they after me? Mr. Bennet didn't slow down. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. They emerged onto a quieter street, empty and dimly lit. Mr. Bennet scanned the area, his mind racing. Evelyn had resources, more than he expected. And now Detective Harper was involved. Before he could decide their next move, Samuel tugged on his sleeve. Mr. Bennet, I think I remember something. Mr. Bennet stopped, turning to him. What is it? Samuel hesitated, struggling to piece it together. A few days ago, a man came to our apartment. He wasn't from around here. He talked to my mom, but she told him to leave. She was scared. I heard him say something about a ledger. Mr. Bennet froze. A ledger. That single word sent alarm bells through his mind. Years ago, when he was still deeply involved in the city's business world, rumors have floated about a ledger, a book containing the names and deals of powerful people in the city. Corrupt officials, criminal organizations, money that changed hands quietly. It was said to be nothing more than a myth. But if it was real, and if Samuel's family had it, that explained everything. Mr. Bennet knelt to Samuel's level, gripping his shoulders. Samuel, listen carefully. Did your mother or grandmother have anything like a notebook? Something they kept hidden? Samuel's eyes filled with confusion and fear. I don't know, but my grandma always kept this old box under her bed. Mom told me not to touch it. Mr. Bennet's grip tightened. That's it. That's what they're after. Samuel's lip trembled. But why? It's just a box. It's not just a box, Mr. Bennet said firmly. And they will do anything to get it. A car screeched around the corner, headlights slicing through the darkness. Mr. Bennet pulled Samuel behind a parked van. Evelyn's black car sped past them, searching. Mr. Bennet knew they didn't have much time. Samuel, we need to get to your apartment. Now. Samuel's face went pale. But were they already there? Mr. Bennet's mind was already working through possibilities. Then we need to be faster. They moved quickly, weaving through back streets. But miles away in a darkened apartment, a figure carefully opened the old wooden box under the bed. Inside, among faded photographs and worn letters, was a small leather-bound notebook. The ledger. And on the first page, written in shaky handwriting, were names, including Evelyn Grant's and Mr. Bennet's. The game had changed. Now, it wasn't just about Samuel. It was about everyone. Mr. Bennet and Samuel moved quickly through the dark, twisting streets, their breath visible in the cold night air. Every sound seemed sharper, the distant hum of cars, the echo of hurried footsteps, the rustling of trash in the wind. Mr. Bennet's mind was spinning, each step tightening the web of danger they were caught in. Evelyn Grant wasn't just chasing a scared boy. She was chasing something far more dangerous. Proof that could destroy powerful people, maybe even herself. Samuel's small hand tightened around Mr. Bennet's. "Are they going to hurt my mom?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Mr. Bennet slowed for a moment, looking down at him. "Not if we get there first." They turned the corner onto Samuel's street, and instantly Mr. Bennet's stomach dropped. A black SUV was parked near the entrance of the old apartment building, its engine idling. Two men stood at the door, speaking quietly into earpieces. "They're already here?" Mr. Bennet muttered. Samuel's grip tightened in fear. Mr. Bennet scanned the area, looking for a way in. The fire escape on the side of the building was barely holding together, but it was their only chance. "Come on." They slipped into the shadows and crept toward the side of the building. Mr. Bennet hoisted Samuel up onto the first rung of the ladder and climbed behind him, carefully guiding the boy upward. The metal creaked under their weight, but the men at the door didn't hear. They climbed to the third floor, stopping at a grimy window. Samuel pointed. "That's Grandma's room." Mr. Bennet used his elbow to quietly push the window open, helping Samuel crawl through first. He followed, landing softly on the worn carpet. The apartment was dark and silent, but something felt off. "Mom!" Samuel called out softly. No answer. Mr. Bennet moved cautiously, checking each room. Then he saw it, the old wooden box sitting on the kitchen table, open. Pages of the leather-bound ledger were scattered, and the air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. Samuel gasped. They were here. Mr. Bennet's jaw tightened. Not long ago. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Mr. Bennet pulled Samuel behind him, bracing for a fight. But it wasn't Evelyn's men. It was Detective Harper, gun drawn. "Bennet, drop it." She stopped, eyes darting to the ledger. Her expression shifted from aggression to alarm. "They got it, didn't they?" Mr. Bennet shook his head. "No, it's still here, but they know where it is." Harper closed the door quickly behind her. "Evelyn's not working alone. Someone inside the department tipped her off. That ledger, it's a death sentence for a lot of people." Mr. Bennet glanced at the ledger. Names, dates, transactions, it was all there. "Then we need to end this tonight." Before Harper could respond, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. They weren't alone anymore. Mr. Bennet grabbed the ledger and motioned to Harper. "At the back." They moved fast, slipping through the back stairwell as footsteps stormed through the front. In the alley behind the building, Evelyn stood waiting, arms crossed. "You really are persistent, William," she sneered, eyes locked on the ledger in his hands. Mr. Bennet didn't flinch. "It's over, Evelyn. I know what's in this book." Evelyn's smile widened. "To you, because it's more complicated than you think." From the shadows, a figure emerged. James, the waiter. But his appearance wasn't the twist. It was who stood beside him. Samuel's mother. "Mom." Samuel's voice cracked, eyes wide with shock. She stepped forward, avoiding Samuel's gaze, her hands trembling. Evelyn smirked. "Tell him, dear. Tell him why we're really here." Samuel's mother's voice was weak. "I didn't mean to, but I had no choice. They said they'd hurt you and Grandma if I didn't give them the ledger." Samuel's face crumpled in confusion. "But you said never to touch it." Tears welled in her eyes. Because it wasn't ours. It belonged to your father. He was part of them. He kept that ledger to protect us. When he died, they thought it was gone. Mr. Bennet's eyes narrowed. So you gave them a fake. She nodded slowly. I tried. But they knew. Evelyn's amused expression darkened. Enough of this. She raised her hand, and James pulled a pistol from his coat. Mr. Bennet tensed, but James hesitated. His hand shook. I didn't sign up for this, James muttered, lowering the gun slightly. Evelyn's expression turned cold. Then you're useless to me. In a swift motion, she pulled her own weapon. But before she could aim, Detective Harper fired. The shot rang out, and Evelyn crumpled to the ground. Silence followed, broken only by Samuel's quiet sobs. James dropped his gun, backing away. Mr. Bennet moved quickly, picking up the ledger. Evelyn was still alive, gasping, her strength fading. You thought you could control everyone, Mr. Bennet said quietly. But this book controls *U*. Evelyn let out a ragged breath, her eyes burning with hatred. Harper approached cautiously. What now? Mr. Bennet looked at the ledger, then at Samuel. We end it, all of it. But just as they thought it was over, Harper's radio crackled. Unit 5, we've lost visual on the second vehicle. Orders. Harper's face paled. There was a second team, she whispered. Mr. Bennet's heart sank. Evelyn wasn't the only one after the ledger. And somewhere in the shadows, the real mastermind was still out there, watching, waiting. The distant hum of sirens grew louder, casting a blue and red glow over the alley. Detective Harper's hand tightened on her radio, her face pale as the realization sank in. Evelyn Grant had only been a piece of a larger puzzle. Somewhere out there, someone else was pulling the strings, someone smarter, more dangerous. Mr. Bennet stared down at Evelyn, who was now slumped against the wall, barely conscious. Her cold, calculating demeanor was gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. For the first time, she looked small, powerless. You were never in control, were you? Mr. Bennet's voice was steady but low. Evelyn coughed, a bitter smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. You think this ends with me? She shook her head slowly. They'll come for you. For the boy, you have no idea what you started. Mr. Bennet leaned in closer, then let them come. Detective Harper placed a firm hand on Mr. Bennet's shoulder. We need to go. The second team could be anywhere. Mr. Bennet gave her a quick nod. Turning to Samuel and his mother, he softened his tone. We're leaving. Now. Samuel clung to his mother, his small frame shaking. She held him tightly, her eyes filled with guilt and regret. I'm sorry, baby. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice breaking. Samuel didn't say anything. He was too overwhelmed to understand the weight of her words. They moved quickly, slipping away from the alley just as the first police cars skidded to a halt. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, surrounding Evelyn and the few of her men who hadn't already fled. Detective Harper led them through the winding back streets, keeping them out of sight. I have a safe house. We'll stay there until we figure this out. As they walked, Mr. Bennet turned to Samuel's mother. You need to tell me everything. No more secrets. Who else knows about the ledger? She hesitated, then spoke quietly. It's not just a ledger. It's evidence, proof of decades of corruption in this city. Politicians, businessmen, law enforcement, even judges. My husband kept it hidden because he knew what would happen if it got out. But after he died, they started searching for it again. Mr. Bennet's jaw tightened, and Evelyn was working for them. She nodded. But she wasn't the only one. There's someone else. Someone higher up. I never saw his face, but my husband called him the broker. He's the one who controls everything. Detective Harper cursed under her breath. I've heard that name before. Rumors, whispers. No one knows who he is. Mr. Bennet exhaled slowly. And now he knows about us. They reached the safe house. an old abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Harper checked the perimeter before ushering them inside. The cold air clung to the walls, but it was safe for now. Mr. Bennet placed the ledger on a dusty table, flipping through the fragile pages. Names, dates, transactions. He stopped when he saw a familiar name. Asterisk William Bennet asterisk. His own name. Confusion washed over him. He hadn't been involved in anything corrupt. Yet here it was, scribbled beside a large sum of money transferred to a company he'd never heard of. Detective Harper peered over his shoulder. That's how they work. They use people without them even knowing. Fake companies, fraudulent deals. You were just another pawn. Mr. Bennet's fists clenched. Not anymore. Suddenly, Samuel's mother stepped forward. Wait, look at this. She flipped to a torn page near the back. Written in shaky handwriting was an address. No name, no explanation. Detective Harper read it aloud. Pier 17. Mr. Bennet's eyes narrowed. The docks. That's where the broker is. Harper hesitated. It could be a trap. Mr. Bennet grabbed the ledger. Or it could be our only chance to end this. Samuel tugged at his mother's coat. Mom, I didn't want to hide anymore. She knelt down, cupping his face. I know, baby, but you need to stay here, where it's safe. Mr. Bennet's voice was firm. We'll finish this, and then it's over. Without wasting another second, Mr. Bennet and Detective Harper headed for the docks. The night was colder now, the city eerily quiet as they moved. Pier 17 was deserted, shrouded in fog. The water lapped softly against the wooden beams. They approached a small warehouse, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, the shadows stretched long, and a single figure stood in the dim light. An older man in an expensive suit. Calm. Collected. The broker. Mr. Bennet tightened his grip on the ledger. The man smiled. Mr. Bennet, I was wondering when we'd meet. Detective Harper raised her gun. It's over. The broker chuckled softly. No, it's only just beginning. Before either of them could react, the walls seemed to move. Armed men emerged from the shadows, weapons aimed. But then something unexpected happened. The men didn't attack. Instead, they lowered their weapons and stepped back. Confused, Mr. Bennet glanced around. The broker's smile faded. From the back of the warehouse, James appeared, holding a small recording device. It's all been recorded, James said, his voice steady. Every word, every threat. Behind him, more officers entered, weapons raised. Detective Harper smirked. You're done. The broker's calm facade cracked for the first time. Mr. Bennet stepped forward. Your empire is crumbling. The broker's hands slowly rose in surrender. The city's shadows finally began to lift. Days later, headlines exploded. Asterisk corruption network exposed. High-profile arrests rocked the city. Asterisk. Evelyn Grant, the broker, and dozens of others were in custody. The ledger's contents were made public, shaking the foundations of power. Mr. Bennet stood outside Samuel's apartment as the boy rode his bike in the fading sunlight. His mother watched from the steps, relief softening her features. Detective Harper approached quietly. We got them all, but it won't be the last we hear of people like them. Mr. Bennet nodded. Maybe not, but at least for now, they're safe. Samuel glanced back and waved. Mr. Bennet smiled faintly. Harper crossed her arms. So, what's next for you? He looked out over the city. I think I'll stick around. Keep an eye on things. Harper smirked. The city could use more people like you. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets, Mr. Bennet knew the fight wasn't truly over. But for now, it was enough. And in the quiet of the evening, the city finally breathed.